Hello, good morning, good afternoon. I would like to talk you through a short text by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher from the 18th century, and as such a representative of what we usually call the Enlightenment, and in particular a representative of some of those ideas in the Enlightenment that anticipate what in the 19th century, so basically in the period after the French Revolution, becomes sociology. So Rousseau is interesting in that respect in particular because he's a huge influence on Durkheim and also likewise a huge influence on all the German philosophers and thinkers who are sort of in the early stages of what then gradually becomes our discipline of sociology, and formulates, although he's a philosopher, he formulates some of the same questions, so as a precursor, if you like, in the 18th century of sociology that is only a product as such of the 19th century. But some of the ideas are already there, and I want to talk you through this text sort of quite literally, bit by bit, because it is not the easiest of reading, in particular, of course, because it is so old. So it is really from a different period before our own period, much more than the texts from the 19th century that we will mostly be reading. But you will see that although the sound is very different, and this is a philosopher, not a sociologist, writing here, and also this is a letter, so it is a very short sort of abridged and condensed version of some of the key ideas of this philosopher, who is one of the key contributors to the Enlightenment. Although I must say that it is not really possible to say or to have one text or even one particular author who would represent that overall thing, the Enlightenment, because if we mean with that a whole range of thinkers in the 18th century, they obviously have quite different positions. And although in your textbooks you will usually find sort of snappy formulations of what the Enlightenment is, they're basically not quite true, because the Enlightenment contains quite a lot of completely contradictory positions that were formulated by different people, also in opposition to each other in the 19th century, and they are all the Enlightenment. So for us, as we are not doing philosophy, of course, the relevant ideas or the things that we want to pick up is those that then transform in the period during and after the French Revolution into our discipline, sociology. So we're looking at the kind of precursor ideas. And of course, when I mentioned the French Revolution, also the philosophy of the 18th century is also important, because some of those ideas fed into the process of the revolutionary period. When at the other end of the revolution, in a sense, as you will see when we look at Comte in particular, you will see that the ideas that then become the discipline of sociology are ideas that emerge in the revolution and immediately after the French Revolution, in order to consolidate and to sort of, in a sense, to end the revolutionary process. So here we are in the sort of beginnings, in the period before the revolutionary process, and when we talk about sociology proper, we are after the revolution, in the period of trying to make sense of, to consolidate, and also to finish off this process. So we are here in a kind of very early stages of some of the key ideas. Now this text, which is not particularly well known, it's actually a rather obscure text, but it is very nice for us to use, I think, because it is short and it contains in very condensed form some of the ideas which otherwise you would only discover by reading a much longer and very complicated, difficult to read text. So this is here sort of an easy entry point in some of these key ideas from the Enlightenment that then translate into our discipline of sociology. So this is a letter that Rousseau wrote, called Letter on, or it is by the editor, it is called the Letter on Virtue, the Individual and Society. So virtue, obviously, how to be good, how to live a good life in society, as stated here as a question relevant for the individual, and also reflects here on the relationship of individual and society, which is of course exactly our theme. So I jump over the very beginning of the letter because it is sort of the preamble, sort of niceties and sort of things. It really begins here on the second page of this of the PDF. If you have the PDF that I uploaded in the first column. So where he says, "It seems to me, first of all, that whatever is moral in me always seeks relations outside myself, and that, had I always lived alone, I would possess neither vice nor virtue, and would be good only by dint of the absolute goodness that causes a thing to be whatever its nature requires." Now this is a quite complicated sentence. So he makes here a distinction between, on the one hand, vice and virtue, which he says come from society, and on the other hand there is something that you would possess if you were not living in society. Obviously that is a sort of a thought play. That is a purely imaginary situation. So if you were living outside society, then the only virtue that you could have would be the virtue of being what your nature requires you to be. So that's basically what Rousseau would call a sort of a natural, or as he calls it here, an absolute goodness. So kind of a concept of goodness outside society, which doesn't actually exist. So this is all these Rousseauian ideas about the situation outside or before societies, they're just imaginary. They're just here for illustration. It's a kind of thought play. So in society, that's where we actually live as human beings, and there we have vice and virtue, but it comes from society, which is a very tremendous thing to say, a very tremendous statement to make, if you consider that in pre-18th century philosophy, virtue would most likely have been connected to religion and to theology and to divinity and so on. So here we have the idea that the concepts of vice and virtue come from society. Now he continues, "I feel too that I have now lost that natural goodness as a consequence of a multitude of artificial relations which are the work of society, and which have given me other pensions, other needs, other desires, and other ways of satisfying them, which are inimical to preserving my life or constituting myself, but consistent with particular views I have formed and factitious passions I have acquired." So he continues with this thought play of contrasting how we actually are as humans in society to a sort of imaginary natural state of being where we would be before or outside society. So we have lost this natural goodness, which is simply you are what you are, and you are sort of good if you simply are what you are rather than being something else from what you are. That is sort of the natural goodness. We have lost that because we live in society, which Rousseau describes here as a multitude of artificial relations. Artificial isn't actually meant here to sound quite so negative as it does for us, perhaps. Artificial simply means created by society, not natural. So these relations in society are social relations. So society creates itself in a sense. That is the idea that's behind these words here. It's the work of society. Society itself is the work of society. It's a self-generating thing. And it creates our needs and desires and how we satisfy them. So by living in society, or at the point when we as humans live in societies and in society and are human in that sense, we create also new needs. Our needs are different from what they would be if we were that imaginary extra-societal being in a state of nature. So we create sort of in society, we recreate as society, we recreate our needs, our desires, and the means with which we meet these needs and desires, and so on. And passions, also the passions that we have in society, are not natural. So that is a tremendous thing to say if you think about it, because sort of in a naive sort of sense, we would probably, without thinking too much about it, say that our passions are sort of natural. If I have a passion for something, then, well, that's simply my passions then. But actually, Rousseau is saying here, also these passions are products of society. So that is the first sort of cracker of a thought here in this very short text. And you can see that here is already a conception of sociology built into these few sentences, that then people like Durkheim or others, Comte, Durkheim and so on, in the 19th century pick up and develop into the properly speaking, into the discipline of sociology. Now, Rousseau continues, from this it follows that I must now consider myself as existing in a different way from this natural state, and must, as it were, appropriate goodness of another sort, suitable to this new existence, the existence in society. Because my life, my security, my liberty, and my happiness, where are we, today depend on the cooperation of others like myself. This reminds us, of course, of the concept of the division of labor that you probably know from Durkheim, or you might also know from other writers from the 18th century, like Adam Smith. Adam Smith's book, the famous book, The Inquiry into the Nature and Origins of the Wealth of Nations, which is the foundational text of political economy, obviously is very much about the idea of the division of labor. That was written 2 or 3 decades after this text, so it is also part of the Enlightenment tradition, but slightly later. So the idea of cooperation between people in society as being a central aspect of society, that seems to be somewhere in the air in the 18th century. That is one of the key discoveries of Enlightenment thinking when it comes to society. So I must look upon myself no longer as an isolated individual, but as part of a larger whole, as member of a larger body, on whose preservation mine depends absolutely. So the preservation of my body depends on the preservation of the larger body, which is society. And again, you will immediately recognize here Durkheim's concept of society as an organism, a body. And any disorder in this body of society, I would necessarily feel as an individual. Now, the next paragraph, he continues that thought and says, I depend on my native land, my patrie in French, the fatherland basically, at least for my needs. My native land, in turn, depends for its needs on some other country. And everything is to one degree or another subject to this universal dependency. So you see, Rousseau in 1757 describes basically what we would call the world system of states that are interdependent and form one large society, which is basically global human society, universal human society of the modern period. That is here already sort of intuitively described, because it doesn't actually yet exist in the form that we are familiar with it. So the idea of a world society exists in its beginnings in the 18th century, of course, but not to the extent and in the density in which we experience our society as part of a universal society, a global society. And in this context of a universal dependency, everybody and all countries depending on each other for their maintenance, for their self-preservation, that also creates the idea that all human beings, so here the word man is used, it is here the generic word men, not men as in male. So all human beings have duties and rights that are common to all of them. So here you see implied in this idea of a universal division of labor and universal interdependency of a human society, a global human society, the idea basically of universal human rights and duties. So we have, as humans, we have human rights, but we also have human duties to each other. So these are interconnected and mutually constitute each other. So this is the first section of the text. And then he basically, Rousseau anticipates an objection from the person to whom he writes this letter, who will perhaps say, well, if society hasn't actually been so good to me, if society hasn't given me that much, then I don't owe society anything. So that's basically, so that would be the kind of slightly grumpy response of somebody who's not totally happy with society, which is probably most of us, I guess. So we probably all have the feeling, society could be that much better to us as individuals, so we don't really owe society that much. And also writes against this potential objection from his pen friend here, and says that, well, to that the state would answer, well, maybe it would have been better for you to have been born in the midst of a desert, but you were born here, and you have lived here, and you could not have survived here had not I sustained you, I, the state. So that is the state speaking here in this in the text. You should have quit this life if it was a burden to you, so somewhat sarcastic and tongue-in-cheek here, and should have quit this country if its laws seem to you too harsh. Die or leave if you wish henceforth to owe me nothing. So that's what the state says to this complaining and unhappy individual. But pay me for the 30 years of life you have already enjoyed with my assistance. So apparently Rousseau's friend is about 30 years old, as is Rousseau roughly. So these guys write this amazing stuff very early in their life. That is one of the depressing things about that. These guys were all very young when they're writing these masterpieces of modern philosophy. So until you are no longer, you owe me for what you have been. So basically Rousseau says the state could reply to that sort of complaint, well, even if you're not terribly happy, just the very fact that you exist and that you are able to complain and that you're able to even think that you are not totally happy, that even that you already owe to my existence, to the existence of the state. State and society in this context, by the way, are pretty much the same thing. So in pre-modern social thinking, state and society are not distinguished. The reason for that is that it is only in modern society, basically really beginning in the 18th century, that the state is actually an entity separate from and opposed to society, or rather that we think of the state as such a thing. Until then, state and society is basically the same thing. Now Rousseau continues, let us not think of ourselves as being like those primitive men of our imagination, right? This is the state of nature idea, so he explicitly says this is something in our imagination. So unlike what you sometimes read perhaps in your sociology textbooks, Rousseau does not say that the state of nature actually existed. It's a thought play. It's something we imagine for the sake of argument. Let's not think we were one of these primitive guys who needed no one, because nature alone supplied all their needs, very conveniently. Nature relinquished her functions, so to speak, the moment we usurped them. Now that's very interesting. We usurped the functions of nature, and we obviously means we as society. So society takes over the functions that previously, maybe in this imaginary state, nature sort of spontaneously provided. But now that we have basically replaced nature with what you could call second nature, which is society, nature is basically out of the picture, because society has replaced nature as having these functions. Social man is too weak to do without others. So we are, this is restating the thing already said before, that we are entirely interdependent with all others in society. Now in the next section also continues this thought of being indebted to society. It is not as individuals that we are all in each other's debts. It is not as individuals that we are all in each other's debt, but as members of society to which each of us owes everything. This is restating the same thing. So he's saying basically you cannot look at, so again this is to this imaginary complaint from his pen friends, and I as an individual have actually not been given such a great hand from society. Then he says, well, you can't look at it at the individual level, you have to look at this at the level of society. Yeah, okay, so you see, this is where this becomes basically sociology. It's not as individuals that we are indebted to each other, but as members of society, to which we all owe everything, because we wouldn't exist as what we are. And this continues, or this follows, from the idea that we are humans only because we live in society. If we were not living in society, then we wouldn't actually be human beings. So the very humanity of ourselves is owed to the fact of society. And then he continues, indeed, the price we pay for the help we receive is itself a gift of society. So he's kind of dismissing the idea that there's basically a sort of exchange relation between one person in society helping another and being sort of rewarded for that, as in an exchange, maybe as in commodity exchange or exchange of services. And he's saying the thing that I pay for the service of the other people, well, where did I get that from? That is already given by society. So we're basically just exchanging things that we don't actually own in the first place, because we are indebted for these things already to society. That's the idea here. Can a man possess anything without the help and consent of others? Rhetorical question, obviously. No. Without this tacit contract. So you have here the word contract. You probably came across the concept of contract theory, of which Rousseau is one of the key representatives in this context. But he's describing it as tacit, and earlier you saw he's describing it as imaginary. So this is as I said, a kind of thought play, a kind of a construction that we make for the sake of argument. Neither profit nor property nor true industry would exist. Industry here means industriousness. All these are owed to society. So basically this means something that you find in Marx's writing, for example. When we produce something, then we are not really producing as individuals, because we're using knowledge and technologies and forms of organization in society that were already there, that we picked up from others who have developed then before we were even born. So when I say, let's say I write a great book, obviously I cannot really say that I have written this book. Okay, I've written it, but through me basically very many others have actually written it. So I'm, in a sense, if I'm the writer of a book, then I'm only the instrument of many others who are actually writers of the book. So there is where the idea of society comes into this. So in the state of nature, nothing exists but what is necessary, and the superfluity we see all around us in society is not the sum total of individual efforts, but the product of general industry. Very important concept here. General industry. I think the word in this early 18th century context, so relatively early stage of the science of society, if you like. Industry means industriousness, so organized productive activities. It doesn't mean industry in the sense of factories necessarily, although they in this period saw the beginnings of large organized manufacturers at least. But industry simply means organized industriousness in society, productive work, somehow organized in in a sort of stable organizational form. which with 100 hands working in concert makes more than 100 men could make separately. So this is, I mentioned already, Adam Smith. So almost literally this sentence from Rousseau would appear in texts such as The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith or others, which is written or published, well, exactly 19 years after this letter was written. So it's in the sort of same period, but quite a few years later. So Rousseau is very much anticipating also some of the basic ideas of classical political economy. So next section, I anticipate another objection from his pen friend, the person to whom he writes the letter. He will speak to me of the disorders of the what? Of the social state. Are we in the right column here? Yes. Disorder of the social state, in which the public good serves as a pretext for so many ills. Right? So this is again the grumpy friend objecting. Well, society does all this nice stuff, but this is actually, the public good is only a pretext for so many ills. So this person, obviously, the person who makes the objection, has a much more negative view of this modern thing, society. So it does public good things, but really, in the end of the day, it's mostly ills. But one must distinguish between civil order and its abuses. That is Rousseau's answer to that objection. So you have to distinguish between the order and the abuses of the order. So he seems to be saying here that these ills that the other person he anticipates will talk about, they are actually the abuses of this order that is established by society. And then the second objection, or kind of, how do you say, come back to the reply to the objection by his friend, is that you also have to distinguish between appearance and reality. So basically he's saying that people who complain so much are basically perhaps deluding themselves. So how many ills that seem dreadful to us are nothing in themselves. So we complain. So there is also something that is perhaps typical of living in society, that we like to complain a lot. That's what Rousseau is saying here. But the things we complain about aren't actually that bad. So you get quite clear sense that Rousseau is overwhelmingly positive about the institution of modern society. So how many men bemoan their fate who might be happy without changing their state, etc., etc. So actually we are moaning, but actually we have it quite well. So that's the argument Rousseau is making here, and you will find much of modern sociology makes similar arguments. So let's not moan so much. So alleged misfortunes are mostly imaginary. We're just making up this stuff. So we just like to complain in modern society. But in the next section, but an advantage infinitely superior to all physical goods, and one of which we undeniably partake owing to the harmony of the human race. Harmony basically here meaning cooperation again. That's quite interesting. Obviously, if you think of, again, I mentioned Adam Smith again, so we have in political economy, you have beginning in that period much more sense that the harmony isn't quite so harmonious. But in Rousseau, you have still here a relatively optimistic notion of society as being sort of harmonious, everybody working together in division of labor and cooperation. So one advantage is that of attaining, through communication of ideas and the progress of reason, the intellectual regions of acquiring sublime notions of order, wisdom, and moral goodness, of nourishing our sentiments on the fruits of our knowledge. That's a nice formulation. So he's saying here that knowledge is the food on which we feed our sentiments. So that is interesting. It's a typical Rousseau sort of thing, not to make such a strict distinction between sentiments and knowledge, but actually he's saying if we have more knowledge, then we feed our sentiments on that, and sentiments also includes moral sentiments, of course. So we are raising ourselves to the grandeur of our souls, above the weaknesses of our nature, and of equaling in certain respects, through the art of reasoning, the celestial intelligences, the intelligence of God. So basically we're becoming like God through knowledge, which in turn feeds our sentiment, including the sense of morality. Until finally, by combating and vanquishing our passions, we gain the power to dominate man and imitate divinity itself. So that is quite bombastic stuff. So through the progress, the intellectual progress, the progress of reason, which creates obviously all the means with which we produce and all the means with which we organize in society, creates order, wisdom, and moral goodness. Yeah, you see there's again also no distinction in Rousseau's writing between moral goodness and the progress of reason, because the progress of reason leads to moral goodness. That's the idea. So basically we're becoming like gods by combating and vanquishing our passions. So that is again an idea from classical philosophy, that through the progress of reason we conquer our passions, and that gives us the power to dominate man. That's interesting. So in Rousseau's vision of the progress of reason is also a vision of domination. That is very, very interesting. And although Rousseau himself seems to mean that here in a positive sense, as readers of Rousseau we can obviously think, dominate man doesn't sound that good. So maybe this imitating divinity has also a downside to it, a sort of a dark side, which is that of domination. So Rousseau mentions it, but he doesn't develop it here in this text at least. But then again, it's just a letter, so you would need to read much more obviously to see whether he does develop this idea in other texts. So this constant commerce of exchange, concern, aid and instruction, learning, the progress of reason, sustains us, enlightens us, etc., etc. And these are the true compensations. So I'm jumping to 6 lines further. The true compensations which console a civilized man for the unhappiness, man or woman. Right, he probably means man. I'm sorry to say. So Rousseau had a reputation for being quite a sexist, actually, in some respects. So when he says a man, obviously he means human being, but on the other hand he probably actually means man. So it's difficult to say. So we can read benevolently and think human being. We can read it negatively and think, yeah, he probably means man, actually. Well, this you can decide for yourselves. So, what were we? The true compensation. So these are the compensations for the unhappiness that is occasioned, that is caused by the loss of natural goods and the abuses of society. So he does admit there are abuses. He does admit there is a loss. So by entering society, we have lost something of this natural, simple goodness of the state of nature, but we are more than compensated for this by the progress of reason and all the good stuff that comes from there. The vigor that was once in his limbs passes into his faculties. Now this is very, very funny. I'm not sure whether he's sort of slightly sarcastic here, but I don't know. The vigor that was once in his limbs passes into his faculties. By faculties he means faculties of the mind, the faculties of reasoning and imagination and so on. His reason rises upon the ruins of his decrepit body. Yep, I can confirm that. If hobbles are placed upon his freedom, his heart gains a new empire. Now this is really interesting. So we lose some of the freedom because society obviously deprives us of freedom. but our heart gains a new empire. So we gain something within, which is more in the area of sentiment, but sentiment and intellect are not so strictly separated in Rousseau's thinking. So we gain something in imagination, in sentiment, in morality. So we are less free, but we are sort of nevertheless more powerful because we gain all these other sort of internal things. Man obeys the voice of the stronger man, but commands his own passions, which is something. So we can dominate ourselves in spite of being dominated by others in society. And while he is oppressed here below, his pure soul soars towards the heavenly abode and savours in advance the reward of his virtue. In advance, right? So I think the idea here is that the reward of virtue, obviously in a religious sense or in a Christian religious sense, comes after death, of course. But we savor this reward already in advance because as virtuous people, we know that we will be rewarded, and that's a good feeling. So, and all this stuff happens in society only. So he is Hercules, who feels himself burning on his pyre even as he becomes a god. It's a very dramatic image. So we are burning, suffering, but in the suffering we become God. Thus, and this is kind of the highlight here, good and evil flow from the same source, but not in equal measure for all. It's very interesting, this little afterthought here. So the first part of this sentence is summarizing the previous thoughts. Good and evil flow from the same source, that source being society. And what Rousseau is basically saying is you can't have the good without the evil, and the other way around. So they are inevitably intertwined in society. So society is this mixed bag of things. And then comes this afterthought that he doesn't develop here, but it's very, very interesting in a perspective of a social theory, but not in equal measure for all. So he does seem to acknowledge in this little sentence here that some get more of the good stuff and some are given more of the evil stuff. So that's that's really sweet that he does acknowledge that in a short sentence. So how does it continue here? We go to the next section. Shall we now ask what can make us happy in this world, which is obviously one of the principal questions of philosophy. So everything that engages our interest depends on foreign objects. Again, so we come back to this idea of interdependence, of cooperation, which society is based on. And we would sooner not exist than go unnoticed. So that is a very contemporary thing. So for us, vanity and narcissism and being noticed is more important than most other things, actually. So this is very highly prized in society. The habit of engaging in commerce with others makes such commerce so necessary that we may doubt that there exists a single person who would not sink into despair if assured at the same time of never seeing another human being again. So actually the commerce itself is more important than the actual things that we are trading. That's quite an interesting thought, actually. So maybe all the trading that we do, all the business basically, is just an excuse to have interactions with other human beings. That's an interesting sort of thought here. Such are the indissoluble bonds that unite us all and make our existence, our survival, our reason, our fortune, our happiness, and in general all our goods and evils depend on our social relations. Again, summarizing the same thing, and we're coming here to the last column. I therefore believe that when I became a civil man, I contracted an immense debt to the human race, and that my life and all the comforts it has brought me should be devoted to the service of mankind. So from this debt follows for Rousseau the obligation, the duty to serve mankind. It's interesting that he sort of switches between society as basically the country and society as mankind. So he kind of quite easily moves from the one to the other, because as he says in the beginning, the patrie, the fatherland, the country, which is France obviously in his case, couldn't exist well, France or Switzerland actually. So he's obviously a resident of both Switzerland and France. I think he's in this point thinking of France much more, but he could be thinking of Geneva or of Switzerland. It doesn't matter, because all countries equally are interdependent with all others, and therefore this debt to society is actually a debt to mankind, to humanity. I would not be able to assure myself of peace and lasting happiness except in a well-ordered society. So there is no peace and happiness in the so-called state of nature. Only society provides that. I see that if I do not respect in others the rights I would have them respected me, I make myself the common enemy of all, and enjoy no more security in the iniquitous possession of my property. So Rousseau is very much a defender of private property. That's important to keep in mind. Property is sort of a precondition of happiness in Rousseau's thinking. Then a highwayman who devoured what spoils they could take from others less fortunate than themselves. So I would basically be a robber, a thief. So my property would be theft. But because I acquire this property and the happiness that comes with it in the context of mutual recognition and mutual recognition of others' rights, it's okay and it's safe and secure and happy and so on. So that constitutes a sacred duty, a general and common duty, and so on. The good habits, like education, that I was fortunate enough to receive, that requires me to commit to this universal order. The French word is police. So police is a little bit more than policy in English. It is more like we have the English word polity. That is probably the closest thing. So which basically means order. So the translation as order here is quite good. But it's good to be reminded that we have obviously the same words in English and in French. Police. Obviously the police as the institution, as in policemen and policewomen, they are an institution working in the name of police, in the sense of polity and policy. So these words are all very closely related. So that is what Rousseau concludes here in this letter on the relationship of virtue, the individual and society, that I am obliged to repay mankind for all the benefits it has bestowed on me. Yes, amen. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I'm sure we can have an interesting discussion on this idea, and think about in what sense or in what context in the sociological theories that you are already familiar with from the 19th and 20th centuries you re-encounter many of the very same ideas that Rousseau is formulating here in the middle of the 18th century. Thank you very much. See you next time.